All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another weekly coaching session. My name is Dylan Pines. I am going to be your mentor for today. So, if you are new here, if you've never done this kind of thing before, here's how this is going to work. I am here to answer any and all questions that you might have relating to anything in music production. So that could be everything from songwriting to recording to mixing to mastering to editing, music business, and everything in between. So before we get started, just to make sure, let me know if you can see me. Let me know if you can hear me all right. Let me know if everything is sounding okay. I'm going to play the DAW for a bit. Let me know if that needs to be any louder or softer as well.
Hello, tired friend. Hello. You found me hiding in Madrid, and I forgot how hard you press your lily padded fingers in my chest.
All right. So I'm seeing some comments saying that everything is loud and clear, sounding good. Awesome. So if this is your first time here, the way that this works, there is a link that is in the emails, all the coaching call emails, that sends you to a question form. So if you have any questions, I would ask that you click that link, go ahead and submit your questions through that form. That just helps me to get everything organized ahead of time. But if you have any follow-up questions, maybe about the topic we're talking about, or maybe I'm answering your question and you've got a little bit more information for me, feel free to put that in the comments. Just make sure to put the words follow-up in all caps before the actual question itself. Other than that, feel free to comment away. There are honestly just as many questions that get answered by the community in the comment section as I answer. So feel free to talk. Sounds so teachery. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves. Lord. Okay. So let me go ahead and grab our questions for today. Okay. So our first topic for today is going to be on recording. We've got a few different recording questions. This first one is on recording extremely dynamic vocals. And it's by Mitchell. I tried for 3 sentences. It's okay. I appreciate you tried. A song I finished has very soft and loud parts vocally. I recorded the verse and chorus's parts separately with different preamp settings for each section on my interface just to avoid clipping, which made it pretty hard to mix and balance the vocals. With the addition to changing the distance of my vocals from up close in the verses to backed up in the choruses with the microphone and sound source distance. I tried the first time to have the preamp set the loudest parts so that they peak at negative 6 dBs, but then the quietest parts seem to hit around negative 24 dBs at most. Is this, almost disappearing from the recording? Get it right at the source issue for sure. Is this okay? Do I need to switch to an omnidirectional microphone? I currently use a cardioid condenser, so I don't have to switch the gain on my mic preamp and the distance from my mic to the sound source. Okay. Great question. This is a really common question when it comes to home recording, especially with vocals, because vocals are so dynamic, right? So first off, you're doing great. Whenever you're saying like, okay, my current workflow is set up in such a way where I'll only go section by section. I'm making sure I'm not clipping. I'm changing up my preamp settings if I need to, backing away from the mic if I need to. I will say if you're changing up your preamp settings anyway, you might as well just keep the same distance from the mic the entire time. You know, the whole get close, back up thing, that's really more if you have like a phrase or a word that's really loud, and you want to keep your preamp settings the same. But if you're okay with changing your preamp settings from take to take, then, you know, go ahead and keep the distance the same, because that will keep the tone the same. Unless you're going for like a difference in tone, like one you're wanting to be really whispery and intimate, and the other one you're wanting to be really like loud and yelly, and you want that tonal shift, then that's totally fine. So first off, good on you for doing that. Always good to avoid clipping. You never, ever, 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 ever want to clip on the recording side, because that is really difficult to get rid of once you get to the mixing side. As for your microphone, you do not need an omnidirectional condenser microphone. That's not really going to help you out with your problem at all. The microphone you're using now, I don't know what mic it is, Mitchell, but the polar pattern is totally fine. That's the one that you're typically going to want to use whenever you're doing vocal recording. Is a, which one did you use? Yes, a cardioid condenser mic. So what I would say is either keep your distance the same and turn up the gain in the verses, your preamp gain in the verses, so that, you know, it's also hitting around -6 dBs, and then turn it down in the choruses. Because that's going to get you kind of a more consistent level of gain automation. Or alternatively, use gain automation. So once you actually have finished up your recordings and you've gone through, you've done your comping, you've done your tuning or whatever, or I guess you could do this before your tuning if you wanted to. You just want to make sure that you're going into the actual region itself and doing what's known as gain automation. And if you've been on these calls for a while, you know that this is something I talk about all the time. This is one of the big kind of pro secret sauces to getting great sounding compression. Because compression tends to work best when you have, you know, a relatively consistent level going on. You know, compression is going to be controlling more the like minute levels, or the minute differences in level between words, rather than the huge differences in level between phrases. So let's say that right here, this verse, you know, I recorded it really quiet, and I recorded this verse really loud, right? So physically, you could just see the difference in these waveforms. You know, one you can tell is going to be really, really loud. My compression is going to be really overreacting to it. Or I'm going to have to set my compression threshold so high that my compressor isn't going to be working on this section really at all. So what would I want to do? Well, I would want to do gain automation. And it's important to know this is not volume automation. Gain and volume, they are both talking about the same thing. They're both talking about amplitude level, right? Gain is before processing. Volume is after processing. So if I turn the volume up, I'm not affecting my plugins at all. If I turn the gain up, I am affecting the plugins. I'm turning up the input level of the channel. Whereas with volume, I'm turning up the output level of the channel. So what I'd want to do here, for example, is, you know, let's say I recorded this, I made sure my distance was the same at all times, but I had to record my verses way too quiet, and I had to record my, I had to record my verses too quiet so that I could record my choruses without clipping. So what I would do is basically just split these regions up. And you can see I've actually already done this on this prior mix. But I would split these regions up. And I would just go ahead and turn up the gain for this verse and turn down the gain for this one. Now, how you do this is different in every DAW. Every DAW has some kind of clip gain. Sometimes it's more hidden than in other DAWs. Pro Tools famously has clip gain lines that are really easy to work with. Logic has the gain hidden over here in this little region drop-down box. It's very annoying how far away it is. But if I go over here, I just need to select my verse, and I can just turn it up, and you can physically see that the waveform is changing shape as I turn it up and turn it down. So honestly, what I would usually do is I would either turn up my verses so that they are as loud as my choruses, even if they just sort of look like they're the same level. That's pretty close, and then I'll just go through and check with my ears, make sure I'm not clipping, make sure anything isn't super loud. Or vice versa, I would go to my choruses and I would turn down their gain. Honestly, I'm going to do one or the other. Neither of them is wrong. They are both very, very good ways of doing gain automation. As long as you have a relatively consistent loudness throughout the song, that's what you're going for. Because you can always use volume automation in the mix to, recreate some of those dynamics. But with the consistency that you're going to be creating with gain automation, you're actually going to be able to get great sounding compression. So hopefully that answers your question. You don't need a new microphone. Either you need to take a little bit more control over your preamp settings, or you need to do some gain automation. Either one will work. So we've got a few follow-up questions, looks like. So let me go ahead, get in here, and check these out. So this is a follow-up from Claude. Excuse me. Would a plugin like Vocal Writer work fast enough to help with recording such a dynamic vocal track, or should we just use a compressor? So Vocal Writer, for anyone who doesn't know, I don't actually think I can open it right now. I'm having some issues with my Waves plugins. But Vocal Writer is a plugin by Waves that kind of does automatic gain automation for you. As to whether or not it's fast enough, I would not say you should use that on a recording, because that is baking it in. I'll very rarely use compression directly on a recording. I know a lot of people do it. That's a Dylan thing. I don't trust myself to get my settings right, especially considering that I'm often recording myself. And if I'm recording myself, I can't really test and make sure that I'm going to be not over compressing with whatever settings that I actually grabbed. Now, sometimes I'll throw on a compressor to get like a dB of gain reduction, but at that point I could just do that in the mix or during my mix prep and get the same results. I'm going to be doing a bounce in place and baking that compression in anyway. I might as well do it later when I have more control over it. So for me personally, I would say hold off on using Vocal Writer on your recordings. If you want to use it on your actual mix, your mix files, to do gain automation, go for it. That's not something that I do anymore. I think we actually had a whole conversation about that last week, why I don't do that anymore. But if that's something that you would like to do because you don't want to take the hassle of going through and doing gain automation, totally fine. Go for it. Okay, we've got a follow-up from David. What about putting verses and choruses in separate tracks so that you can EQ the close and distant mics differently? Because you would have more room tone in the distant mics. That might also cut down on automation. David makes a great point. I actually do this. You can see this. In every single mix I have, will have a Vox verse track, a Vox chorus track, and a Vox bridge track. Because oftentimes the people that I mix for, they will move closer or farther away from the mic depending on what part of the song they're singing. Also just because I often will want to mix my vocals just a little bit differently in the choruses than I will in the verses, so that they're a little bit more present, a little bit more intense. This is not a great thing to do if you have CPU problems. Like if you're constantly crashing, this quite literally triples the amount of plugins that you have to use on your vocals. So I would definitely not recommend it if you're having that problem. But if your computer is solid and you're not having any issues with that, then yeah, I would definitely recommend using this system. I personally still do gain automation anyway. And that's because I'm not only automating sections, but I'm also automating phrases, individual phrases. But if that's something you don't really want to deal with, then you could absolutely use this system for that. Let me go ahead and undo all this real quick. There we go. We've got a follow-up from Oliver. When I normalize, could I skip this gain staging? It depends on the system that you have for normalization. If you are normalizing everything so that it's all peaking at -6 dBs, for example, which is something I talk about doing for drums and like really percussive tracks, that's gonna put a lot of tracks way too hot if they are particularly sustained instruments. Like that's gonna make your bass, for example, really, really hot if it's peaking at -6 dBs. And that's kind of on a whole different subject of, that's more talking about gain staging and hitting that negative 18 dBFS or 0 dBVU digital sweet spot, right? But as far as gain automation goes, you can use normalization for gain automation, but if you do that, you want to be so careful, and B, you want to make sure that you are going through and splitting up each phrase in your vocals, because otherwise, it's not really going to do what you need it to do. Vocals are really, really dynamic, and sometimes there might be a super fast peak in an otherwise quiet section that might mess up all of that normalization work that you already went into. So can be done, but you definitely need to go through and double check your work. Okay, let's see if we have any other follow-ups. Right, great, I think we're good. Okay, let's move on to our next question. So this is from Ethan Morissette. Are there any ways I can detect which frequencies are the most problematic in my room? My room is 10 feet by 12 feet by 8 feet, and it is carpeted and has a queen mattress occupying one corner of the room. Oh man, this sounds like my old bedroom studio, almost to an exact T. My room is not treated with acoustic panels or bass traps. Oof, yeah, you want to get on that. Are there any ways I can diagnose which frequencies are the most problematic for my room and what types of treatment will benefit me the most? Additionally, is there a way I can tell how the placement of my monitors in my room affects the sound of my mix? Ethan, absolutely. This is a but. What I'm about to tell you to do, this process is just an absolute but. But it is going to get you the answers that you want. You're just going to have to put in a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get those answers. So what you need to download is something called Room EQ Wizard, REW. This is a free software, totally free. And it basically takes tons of different measurements of your room using a special microphone, and then gives you like, I forget what these things are called. Waterfall graphs is what they're called. They give you different waterfall graphs of the frequency response of your room. So let me actually look up an example. Room EQ Wizard waterfall, because I don't really want to get it up on my side. Yeah, okay, here's a good example. Okay, let's find the multicolored one. So a waterfall graph is basically a frequency graph. Like this is just your regular frequency graph from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. Although this one actually looks like it's zoomed in on 10 to 200 hertz. So keep that in mind. It is a decibel graph. So same as like a regular EQ frequency spectrum. If it's super loud, it's super high. And then it adds one extra axis with time. So it shows you how long these frequencies are lasting. So it shows you where the frequencies are, which frequencies are loudest, and which frequencies are lasting the longest. And you need all three of those pieces of information to figure out where the problem areas are in your room. Because sometimes you'll have particular frequencies that are really loud, but they die off very quickly. That's kind of helped in one way. Other times you might have frequencies that aren't super loud, but they just last forever. And that's a whole other problem. With the first one, you are going to basically hear frequencies where there are no frequencies. The second one, you're going to get a smearing effect. The sound of your speakers is not going to be accurate because if you were to play one tone for 1 millisecond, you are actually going to be hearing, excuse me, that sound for, I don't know, man, 200 milliseconds because your untreated room has a few areas where it's just lasting forever. And you can tell that by looking at a waterfall graph. Now, Room EQ Wizard is, I'm going to be candid, it's pretty complicated and it's not very user-friendly. It's freeware. It's made by developers, not really made to be sold. And when things aren't made to be sold, they're not made to be used easily, right? So definitely something that I would go and do some research on once you download it. So first important thing, get Room EQ Wizard, figure out how to use it. Second important thing, get a measurement microphone. Okay, that's really important. You have to get a measurement microphone. You can't use any old mic that you have to do this because every single mic has its own EQ pattern. And if your mic's EQ pattern is interacting with what the microphone is picking up from around the room, then you're not really going to have any idea what the problem areas of your room actually are. Now, I will say you can always buy a measurement microphone, use it, and then return it if you want to do that. I kind of do this once a year, honestly, just because my desk will move over time just as I do my life, right? Stuff around my room will move over time as I do my life. So it's nice to kind of recheck and make sure if I need to move my speakers somewhere or add any acoustic treatment. So I might recommend you invest in one. But if you're really trying to keep it on the cheap side, then you can definitely buy one, use it, return it. So as for what you actually would use this to do, this is a lot easier to use when you're figuring out speaker placement. I'll be honest with that. Because you can try out tons of different configurations with your speakers so that you can basically just constantly get different waterfall graphs for each way you have your speakers. One where it's closer to the wall, one where it's on a different wall, one where the speakers are closer together, one where the speakers are farther apart, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think to pick my current speaker location, I think I did like 20 or 30, and I ended up picking the one that worked the best. Even though, weirdly enough, it was the one that didn't really make sense acoustically. And I'm still trying to figure out why exactly my desk is so close to the back wall, because I definitely should be farther this direction to kind of match the common rules of thumb for placement. As for treatment, acoustic treatment, this is probably going to tell you things that you already know. right? In a standard, untreated, boxy room, you're going to have a big problem with your low end and your low mids. Honestly, you're going to have a big problem with everything. But once you put up your acoustic treatment, if you don't get enough bass traps, you're going to have a big problem with your lows and your low mids, which is going to lead to you having your lows and low mids too quiet in your mixes, and it's going to lead to you having too much lows and low mids in your recordings. So you're going to have very muddy recordings. So as far as figuring out what treatment your room needs, I could probably just tell you that. Figuring out speaker placement is just as important and a lot more complex, and you definitely need to be using this system to do it. But there are a few videos on acoustic treatment on the Musician on a Mission member site. I would definitely go do a quick search, watch through those. Those are going to give you all of the details as far as like what acoustic treatment you need, where to place acoustic treatment, what kind of acoustic treatment you should be investing in. That's going to get you a lot more of those answers. And ultimately, between these two things, you'll probably be able to get a pretty solid sound out of that room. But you will also probably have to sacrifice some of the space of that room, because you're probably going to have your desk pretty far away from the wall, centered in the middle of a wall. You know, your bedroom's going to have to kind of become your workspace with a bed in it, which is sort of the unfortunate part about bedroom mixing, but that's the world we live in. So let's see if we've got any follow-up questions before we move on from there. Anne asks, does anyone know if REW is similar to SonarWorks? No, it's not. So SonarWorks, it uses a similar concept in measuring, but the outcome is very different. SonarWorks only shows you where the loud and quiet peaks and valleys in your room are. You know, where are the nodes, where are the cancellation points, whatever. But it doesn't show you what frequencies are lasting the longest. Those are going to be the ones that are causing that smearing effect. And SonarWorks cannot fix that smearing effect. It does not do that. It only affects the static frequency. So, you know, it gets you a more balanced frequency as far as loudness goes. But smearing, you know, that is 100% going to be good acoustic treatment and good placement of your speakers, not SonarWorks. That said, if you use SonarWorks, you can use their measurement microphone that they gave you whenever you went in to do that whole process. You know, that's actually what I use. I use that microphone not only to figure out speaker placement, but also to figure out what SonarWorks needs to be working with, what kind of graph, so that my mixes, you know, even though I still have problems with certain frequencies smearing the effect of my mix, I have a much more balanced frequency taste, which is great. Kent says, do you guys send us the recorded version of this meeting? Kent, this is available typically on YouTube as a repeat after I finish up the live stream itself. And actually, it ends up getting posted on the Facebook group, oftentimes with topics covered. So I would just keep an eye out for that. As far as like physical, actual files, we don't do that, but we do allow you to access the coaching calls after they happen. Okay, we've got... looks like we've got a few follow-ups. We've got a follow-up from Lorenzo. This is on resonances and Room EQ Wizard. Does it make sense that, as a rule of thumb, EQ deals best with time zero of the waterfall, and reverb attenuation at different frequencies deals best with the later times? Okay, let me read that one more time. Does it make sense that, as a rule of thumb, EQ deals best with time zero of the waterfall, and reverb attenuation at different frequencies deals best with the later time. So I'm going to assume what you mean is that EQ deals best with the static frequency problems of a room, and using basically just different reverb settings that soak up frequencies at certain areas is going to help you most with this kind of problem. Yes to the first one, no to the second one. I also said that very poorly. If that makes no sense. It didn't make much sense to me either. Just in how I said it. So an EQ, yes, that is going to help you with some of the parts of the room that are either too loud or too quiet. That's actually what SonarWorks is it just slaps on an EQ onto your master bus that is tailored to compensate for the inconsistencies in your room and kind of flatten the sound out. As for reverb, which damping is what you're referring to, reverb damping, that is, the smearing effect is going to happen whether you're using reverb or not. This is a problem with the room, like literally just different frequencies getting caught in between walls, bouncing back and forth, and lasting way, way longer than other frequencies do, just because of their particular frequency shape. That gets into some really heavy acoustical physics that we really just don't need to get into. But I would say this doesn't really deal with reverb at all. That's kind of a whole separate thing. And I would maybe avoid putting an EQ on the master bus, unless it's SonarWorks, just because, SonarWorks has such a specific algorithm that I don't know if I would trust myself to put on my own monitoring EQ. That's something that I might only trust them to do. I could try it. You can certainly try it. I just don't know how accurate it would be. And you would definitely want to make sure that you bypassed it anytime you did any sort of bouncing. Because otherwise, that EQ is going to affect everything. And, it's the opposite of what you want. We got a follow-up from Paul. My room is so bad, it will never be good. So I got some very high-end open-backed headphones, and I do it all on them. Can you comment on that? Yeah, so I definitely think that's the way to go if you're just stuck with a terrible, terrible room. That's why I got these. Is my old room was really terrible, and no amount of acoustic treatment that I added really fixed the problem. And so I just invested my money into some really, really good mixing headphones instead. It is not a perfect solution. Headphones are never going to 100% take the place of mixing speakers, because this is more useful for detail work, using it as a magnifying glass. Whereas speakers are more useful for sort of broad swaths and, 1,000 feet looking down kind of stuff. But if you can only choose between one or the other one, I would 100% say get a really good set of mixing headphones if you're in a terrible room, and just use those until you can be in a better room, rather than sticking with using your speakers in a really, really bad room that is functionally unfixable. So I'd say that you're good to go on that. And then we have a follow-up from Brandy. Would you hire that's a hard word to pronounce. Would you hire an acoustician? It's actually not hard to pronounce. It's just hard to read for some reason. Martin and Spaceless Design have been so great. I sent measurements of my room, and they sent back a virtual design with treatment included on the walls. That's definitely something you can do as well. They can kind of do a lot of this stuff for you just using math. So if this isn't something you want to mess with, you can absolutely do that. I don't know how expensive that is, if I'm being honest, but certainly something that you could try. And then finally, we've got a follow-up from Jonathan saying, what headphones do you have? I use Shure's SRH 1840s. They're open-backed headphones. Okay, let's move on to our next question. All right, so this is our question from Lee. What differentiates cinematic VSTs from conventional VSTs? So VSTs from Heaviosity, Output, and some of the VSTs from Native Instruments and numerous other manufacturers are often described as cinematic. I'm curious to know more about what characterizes cinematic VSTs. What are your thoughts about using cinematic VSTs alongside traditional VSTs when creating regular songs, which are often centered around vocal performances? So every single VST company is going to have their own definition for that kind of thing. Every single virtual instrument is going to have its own definition. There's not like an industry standard for what makes something cinematic versus otherwise. What I would say is that cinematic, the samples tend to be a little bit more epic in scope, or extra soft in scope, if it's for like a tender scene or whatever. And they tend to have a lot more reverb kind of baked into the sound. They tend to be a lot bigger. You don't see a lot of like solo, cinematic solo cellos. You tend to see a lot more like cello sections that are cinematic. So they tend to be a lot bigger, and they tend to have a lot more reverb, a lot more hall reverb. If you're getting kind of like a regular virtual instrument, typically, and take this with a big grain of salt, because typically means, honestly, this isn't even really a rule of thumb. But I would say if it doesn't describe itself as a cinematic virtual instrument, then it probably has a much drier sound, or it at least gives you the option of having a much drier sound. Like, it probably sounds more like it was recorded in a music studio rather than being recorded in a concert hall or a scoring stage. That's kind of the big difference that I would say between the two. And as far as using them for regular songs, I don't know if it matters a ton, but I personally am definitely more of a fan of using traditional virtual instruments rather than cinematic ones. Just because they give me a lot more control over the reverb, and I kind of need that for mixing. Because there's so much reverb that's kind of baked into the cinematic ones. They can be very helpful for cinematic moments in songs, but they're a little bit more niche use rather than sort of big general use. So that's kind of what I would go with for that. But again, big grain of salt as far as quote unquote traditional virtual instruments, because that particular brand might just not use the label cinematic, but it's got the same properties of a cinematic virtual instrument. So definitely something to keep in mind. Okay. Let's see if we have any other follow-ups. Oh, we do. So one from Omez299. What are some good open-backed headphone options? Budget, high-end, midway. I mean, these are great for high-end. Or maybe these are mid. I honestly don't know. I think these are like $500. They're definitely headphones that are way more expensive than this one. So I would say this is probably middle of the road as far as like mixing open backed headphones go. High end, oh boy. I don't know. I've never used them. And then low end. Oh man. How much are the Behringer ones? Or not Behringer, the Beyerdynamic. Beyerdynamic. These are probably more budget. These low end ones, they're about $200. And you know, I actually have the Beyerdynamic Studio versions of those, like the closed studio headphones. They are great. They feel super comfortable. can't comment on their accuracy. I've never owned them. But Beyer Dynamics is a fantastic company. So if I had to give a budget option, that's probably the one I would give. A mid option, the SRH 1840s. And a high-end option, I have no idea because I've never bought one. I've never used one that are like $3,000 before. Oh yeah, and a lot of people are a big fan of the Sennheiser 660s, I think is what they are. I believe the 660s are actually what Rob uses. And they're also mid. You know, they're $500. They're not cheap. Oh, Lead to Be as a follow-up says, what about virtual instruments with emotional in the title? Would you say that's more towards cinematic? Yes, I would say that's definitely more towards cinematic if it says quote-unquote emotional. That's typically going to be, again, a little bit more of a niche use virtual instrument. But I can't really tell you these things. Like, you kind of have to go and try them out for yourself. See if they have the sound that you want. If they do, awesome. If they don't buy it. Lorenzo has a follow-up as well. Would you say that it is intrinsically difficult to record dry sections like brass and strings? Have virtual instruments for orchestra sections, cinematic or not, all have some reverb baked in necessarily? I mean, yes, all virtual instruments, no matter what, have some reverb baked in necessarily because they were recorded with a microphone, and anything recorded with a microphone has some reverb baked in inherently, whether it is very little or not. You know, quote unquote reverb is just the sound of sound waves bouncing around the room. That's going to get picked up by a mic no matter what. It's part of the reason that recording in treated rooms is so important, because even if you get really close to a microphone, you know, you're kind of going to lower the amount of room reflections that you capture with that mic, but they're still going to be there. As for sections like strings or like brass, as you said, it is a lot more difficult to record quote unquote dry versions of those. String players famously use the room reverberations to tune themselves. It was always very, very weird recording string players in like small studio spaces in college because they would just be super in tune anywhere else. And in there, they would get in there and their intonation would just be terrible. And it's just because of how they use those reflections to help them center the pitch. So it is difficult, but it certainly can happen. I would just say that recording it quote unquote dry doesn't happen a ton. It's more that they are being recorded in smaller studios with more acoustic treatment, more diffusion. They're getting a much smaller decay time. The microphones are a lot closer to the instruments themselves. It's not getting rid of it entirely, but it is giving you we'll just say a manageable version. So it's as dry as it can be, but it's never going to be dry. Again, no virtual instrument is dry. They're all just recorded in really, really great studios that allow them either the reverb to kind of vanish behind the sound, or they're just recorded very, very close. Okay, let's move on to our next question. So we've got a couple from Dylan Kelly on compression. So this first one is on sub-bus levels. Does it matter if my sub-buses, like my drum bus, my kick bus, my snare bus, etc., are close to clipping, or in some cases clipping, on the dBFS scale, as long as my mix bus isn't clipping and has at least 6 dBs of headroom? And should I try to get these sub buses in the 0 dB VU sweet spot? Yeah, just don't clip on any faders ever. There is an argument that can be made that as long as you're not clipping the final output, the clipping distortion doesn't happen. That's a very dangerous argument to take to heart. So I would just say across the board, don't clip ever. If you see any fader clipping, you need to either turn down some other volume faders, or you need to add like a gain plugin at the beginning of that channel and turn that down that way. If you mix correctly, you should never get close to clipping. Like if you start a mix super hot, like you mix around your vocal, but you leave your vocal at 0 dBs, then it's going to be very difficult to not clip. That's part of the reason why we typically say, hey, when you start your mix off, put your loudest track at somewhere between -10 and -5 dBs on the fader. That's going to give you a lot more room to grow, and it's going to keep you from clipping it pretty much immediately. As for your sub buses, I do try to get them into the 0 dB VU sweet spot. You have mentioned entirely drum stuff. That's not possible, right? That's something that I've talked about a lot in the digital world, because drums and percussive elements are so fast and VU meters are so slow. VU meters just don't register drums. They don't register drums accurately, basically. Like they register everything else accurately, but not drums. So with drums, as I've kind of said in the past, I'll normalize my drums to peak at -6 dBs. I kind of picked that number out of thin air. There's no like hard science reason why I picked that number. Just in Logic, I can only turn my fader up by 6 decibels. So I was like, great, if I turn my fader up all the way, it's going to just barely not clip. And so I kind of do the same thing for my buses as well. So I'll turn down, let's say I've got like 3 different snare mics. Whenever I'm mixing my snare mics together to get the sound that I want, I'll typically get the sound that I'm looking for, and then I'll turn all 3 of them down until they are peaking at that -6 dB level on my sub bus, with my sub bus's fader all the way up. And then typically I'm going to turn my fader down so that it actually makes sense in context of the mix. So I don't try extremely hard to get all of my sub buses to sit at 0 dB VU, but it is something that like I at least try to do. Again, with the exception of drums. With drums, I will try to get them to sit at -6 dBFS at the most. Just because that's as close as I'm going to get to that digital sweet spot, or rather as close as I personally, Dylan, am comfortable with. Okay, let's see if we have any follow-ups. We've got a follow-up from DJM. Sure, it depends. I'm sure it depends. But if you experience a small clip in a brief instance on a fader or two, could you utilize some limiting to compensate? Yeah. If you just wanted to throw a limiter on a particular fader because there's just like a moment that's a problem, that's fine. Go for it. As long as it doesn't make that particular moment sound distorted or overly processed, then you're 100% fine. I'm still going to stick with, set up your volume mix at the very beginning so that that's not even a problem. But if you've worked through a mix and that becomes an issue, and it's only an issue twice in over the course of a song, then just throw on a limiter at the very end of a plugin chain. Set it to 0.1 dBs or whatever, and you should be good to go. Okay, let's move on to Dylan's other question. And this is on groove style compression threshold. In the compression breakthrough course, you say to lower the threshold on drums so low that you're catching the hi-hats for groove style compression. how low should I lower the threshold typically for other instruments like vocals or guitars? So this is something that is the case for, what I'm about to tell you is the case for any of the styles of compression that require a low threshold. There's not really a specific trick for groove style compression outside of the fact that if a particular instrument isn't super groovy, I don't know if groove style compression is going to sound very good on it. Like if you've got a very dynamic vocal performance, groove style compression isn't really going to do what you want it to do. I'm trying to think of a good... Okay, let's go over here to this bass. You can do it on the bass. And I'm just going to turn all this off. And let's bring up Pro C. Why is it looking like this? This is a first. Huh. Oh, display. There we go. I don't know why that was happening. Okay, so before we do anything, I need to zero out my compressor because that's going to help me to set my threshold. So I'm going to set my attack and release as fast as possible, my ratio as high as possible, my threshold as high as possible, my knee all the way off. And then for this particular plugin, I'm going to set it to classic mode. That just makes it easier to use for this style of compression specifically. So this is going to sound bad. It's not supposed to sound good. I have the attack and release super fast and the ratio super high, specifically so that I can have my threshold working as accurately as I possibly can, so that I can set it accurately, and then I'll get all the rest of my settings correct. So let's think about it this way. I talk about how a high threshold targets the peaks, a low threshold targets the valleys, or most of the valleys. So a high threshold is basically just going to be set to where it's getting occasional spikes of gain reduction. Or consistent spikes, but spikes, that's the key word. Just moments, just beep, like this. You can see how I'm just getting like little moments of just da, da, da. It's going away as quickly as it comes. That means I have a high threshold. I've set my threshold to be activated by the peaks and the peaks alone. With a low threshold, I have it set to where it's going to be activated by both the peaks and the valleys. What I'm looking for, and this is the case for any instrument, is I'm looking for longer amounts of gain reduction. I want my compressor to be turned on for a longer amount of time. So I'm not saying that your compressor needs to be turned on 100% of the time. If your compressor is turned on 100% of the time, you've probably set your threshold too low, or you have a very, very thick instrument. So you've got like a hyper distorted guitar. I'm not really going to be able to do punchy style compression or groove style compression if there's no valley and everything is a peak. But with this, I might turn it down until it's still going back to zero, but it's lasting for maybe half a second instead of like a few milliseconds. So you can see it's still returning to zero, right? And it's returning to zero still fairly quickly, but it's not a momentary spike anymore. So at this point, I will say like, okay, great. My threshold is set correctly for that style of compression. Now I just need to go in and mess with my attack and release, mess with my knee, mess with my ratio, and I'm done. So if I was wanting to get groove style compression, that is a slow attack, a fast release, timed to the song. So I would just open up my delay time calculator, which if anyone is confused about what I'm talking about, this is all stuff that I cover in Compression Breakthrough. So I would definitely go and check out that course after you've gone through, the rest of the mixing course. That's going to fill in a lot of gaps if you have just no idea what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's say I would want to set this, let's just say to 29.5 for both the attack and the release. 29.5, 29.5. Great. Okay, so I'm now getting some pumping, which is what I'm going for groove style compression. Now I'm going to take my ratio all the way down, and I'm going to just turn it up until I'm getting the amount of gain reduction I want, which, man, I don't know. Maybe in this situation, it's just 3 dBs. And this is what's cool about, this style of compression. We're setting up your compressor this way is like, because I've set my threshold correctly, I can use really aggressive ratios and still only get a few decibels of compression. So I've just got a way more accurate compressor, which is great. I change up my knee a bit. And then I believe for groove style compression, I'm just wanting to turn up my makeup gain until it's peaking at the same spot. So peaking at about -30.8. Okay, so I just 2 dBs. Yeah, and you can pretty much see what this is doing. It's increasing the peak, and it's increasing the latter half of the valley, but the initial part of the valley is getting pumped down. That's kind of what this style of compression is meant to do. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. This is from Ethan Morissette. What is the most common kind of compression on the mix bus? What type of compression is most often needed on the mix bus? For example, consistency or thickness, etc. How many layers of compression would you recommend on the mix bus? What do you typically look for in gain reduction on the mix bus? I'm going to answer the easiest question first, which is gain reduction. I never want to get more than 2 decibels of gain reduction on the mix bus at the most. Usually I'm wanting only about 1 decibels of gain reduction, unless I'm doing some parallel compression, right? Like if I'm using my mix knob, if I have my mix knob set at 50%, maybe I'll occasionally get up to 4 dBs of compression, because if it's at 50%, that kind of functionally means I'm getting only 2 dBs of compression. But I'm going to aim for 1 with an occasional spike at 2. As for how many layers of compression would I recommend, you can absolutely just get away with 1. I get away with 1 most of the time, if I'm being honest. You can use multiple layers if you would like. I probably wouldn't do more than 2, mostly because that means you're going to be stacking just a ton of, if you're using like an analog compressor, a ton of saturation all on top of your mix bus, which might be problematic, especially if you have like a tape machine and like a digital summer and, maybe analog EQ. Like, it's just going to add up over time. So probably no more than 2 compressors on your mix bus. As for what type of compression is most often used, the 3 types of compression that you'll see used are groove, consistency, and thickness. You don't typically see punch, and you don't typically see the other, less commonly used styles as well. The reason you don't see punch quite as much is because that tends to do the opposite of gluing, because it tends to increase peaks and decrease valleys, which yes, I mean, sometimes that can sound good on a mix bus, but more often than not, it kind of does the opposite of gluing. It almost expands rather than glues. As for which of those three are the most common, I'd say thickness is probably the least common of those three. Partially because thickness style compression is limiting. You know, it's limiting with a very, very low ratio in comparison to a limiter, which is just a 100% infinity ratio. So you don't see that quite as often, but it's certainly something that you can add to your mix bus. I've done it before. Consistency is something that you would add if you're trying to, get more consistency. But if it's something that is constantly being turned on, then you probably need to adjust your mix. It's almost there to like help to squish your mix together just a hair in moments where something gets out of line rather than constantly being turned on. I'd say groove style compression is probably the most used. Partially because you'll very often hear people say they want to use a slow attack or a medium attack on a mix bus compressor, just because mix bus compression can really screw up your sound if you use it incorrectly. It can really suck a lot of life out of your vocals, or out of your mix. And you'll typically see people talk about using a faster release, simply because if you have a very long release, sometimes compression can be added to too many notes. Like if there's a snare hit that triggers the compressor and you have a very long release time, you may end up turning down the snare hit, but you're also going to turn down, the rest of that measure, for example. Which is why you typically see consistency compression done more sparingly rather than being used constantly. So I would say that's probably the most common. I'm not saying that is what you should be using every time. I'm just saying it's the most common. And then as far as like layering, you can use multiple layers of the same kind. You can use 2 layers of consistency compression if you want to keep your settings the same, but you want to have a ever so slightly lower threshold on the second one. You can use layers for thickness or for groove if you're just kind of wanting to, again, maybe get just a little bit of compression on the first one so it doesn't work very hard, and then it allows you to kind of mess with your threshold on the second one. If you're using the same style of compression, really the whole point of serial compression is because it allows you to mess with your threshold settings to have more accurate thresholds as the next compressor kicks in. If you're wanting to mix styles of compression, you can do that if you want. Obviously, if you do that, you're going to change up all of your settings. You're going to have to completely reset your threshold, and that's totally fine because you're also going to have to reset your attack and release and ratio, blah, 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 blah. But as I said, on the whole, there's so little amount of compression. There's such little amount of compression added on mix bus compressors that doing layers, I've done it. You can just very easily get away with not having layers of compression on it. Okay, let's move on to our next question. This one is from Tiff. What are some common uses of the 4 main styles of compression? Consistency, thickness, punch, and groove. For example, do mixers often go for punchy drums, thick bass, so on and so forth? Okay, let's starting at the first one, consistency. Consistency is the most common form of compression. It is kind of what you think of when you think of compression. Turns the loud sounds down, turns the quiet sounds up. The difference being that it is focusing on individual notes, the macro dynamic range, not the micro dynamic range. It's not changing up peaks and valleys. It's turning down and turning up entire notes. So if you are trying to just get a more consistent performance out of an instrument, that's what you're going to go with, consistency compression. Now, you don't typically use consistency compression on virtual instruments, synths, or samples. Virtual instruments and synths, you have control of the MIDI. I would 100% just do the MIDI instead. Samples typically have already had some consistency style compression added to them, so you don't really need to add any more. As far as like most common uses of that, vocals are the most common for sure. After that, oh man, maybe bass, maybe acoustic guitar. I mean, definitely background vocals. Electric guitar is iffy. If it's super distorted, you won't see that quite as often. And that's just because, like I said before, it's kind of a sausage. There's not much difference between the peaks and the valleys, which means it's very, very difficult to actually get any differences in peaks. And that's kind of what you're trying to control. Okay, moving on, looking at thickness. Thickness you will most commonly see used on drums. If you're thinking of like, quote unquote, New York style compression on drums, in parallel where you just compress the living hell out of something and then mix it in to kind of get a bigger sound, that's just thickness style compression. Fast attack, fast release. Although sometimes you will see New York style compression done with groove style, slow attack, fast release, but you'll typically see it done with a fast release. But thickness gets a lot more of the room out of it. So you get, again, not a punchier sound, but you get a much bigger sound. Thickness also helps to create headroom. That's technically a whole other style of compression, something that I go over in Compression Breakthrough. So check that out there if you're curious. Other than that, sometimes you'll see it done on electric guitar that isn't already super thick. Like if it's not super distorted, you'll sometimes see it on that. You'll sometimes see it on bass. You'll sometimes see it on synthesizers. Basically, I mean, outside of consistency, thickness, punch, groove, any other style of compression you can use on synth, samples, software instruments. It's just consistency is the only one where it's like, hey, this just isn't really all that necessary. Honestly, thickness, punch, and groove, all of those you see pretty consistently on drums. Just depending on what you're going for. Drums are just very easy to manipulate with compression as far as like tonally, what their tone sounds like. Punch, you'll see that with vocals sometimes because punch puts things kind of farther forward in the mix. Sometimes you'll see that done on over distorted electric guitars to kind of reintroduce some dynamics. Sometimes you'll see it done on, again, software, synths, samples, whatever. You'll see it done on basses occasionally if they need more attack, but they're already super sustained. And then for groove is something that you'll see done on anything that is, anything that is groovy. I mean, literally just think of that word. But in reality, anything that would benefit from having sub-accents. So I typically will stick with the rhythmic section. So drums, bass. Maybe if I have a very rhythmic electric guitar, I'll put it on that. But I'm not really going to put it on my lead because there's not much of a need for me to put it on my lead. I'm not going to put it on my strings because there's not much of a need for me to put it on my strings. Groove style compression enhances the groove. It makes you bob your head more. If it is an instrument that is not meant to make you bob your head more, then it's not meant for groove style compression. Okay. that's what I would say for the main 4 styles of compression. Drums for everything, consistency for very dynamic things or very upfront things, not synth samples, software instruments. Groove for groovy sounds, punch for sounds that need to be farther forward or sounds that need more dynamics, reintroduced into them. And then thickness, if you're trying to get literal thicker sounds, bigger sounds, sounds that just take up more room in the mix. Okay, let's see if we have any follow-ups. And then we probably have time for maybe one more. Okay, we have a follow-up from Lorenzo. In serial compression, why would one use different compressors and have to change settings rather than using the same one? Is it for tone? Yeah, so they are accomplishing different goals if I'm using serial compression, right? And this is another part of compression breakthrough that I'm not going to be able to fully explain in the limited amount of time that we have. But you can use different styles of compression to accomplish different goals. So the main goals of compression are to enhance the tone. Oh man, I got to remember my own course. It's been so long since I've taken that course. I got to remember the words that I used. To glue is one. To enhance the tone is one. To fix sounds is one. That one's a lot more specific. And then I'm totally blanking on the last one. It's basically consistency, to create a consistent mix, but that's not the word that I used. I'm totally blanking on it. But if I'm trying to accomplish different goals on the same audio file or the same bus track, then I'm going to use different compressors. I might want to glue a whole bunch of different drum sounds together, but then I might want to change up the tone a little bit. So if I'm trying to glue sounds together, I'm going to use one of the 3 styles of compression that can accomplish that goal, being the same ones I talked about with the mix bus, groove, consistency, or thickness. If I'm trying to change up the tone, well, then I'm going to go with one of the 3 styles of compression that can do that, which is punchy, thick, and groove, right? I might actually do them differently as well. I personally, I tend to do more enhancing compression in parallel. So if I'm like, oh, I want a much thicker sound, I might create a send, create a parallel compressor, compress the ever-loving hell out of it, and then mix it in subtly. That kind of gets me the tonal change that I'm looking for. Whereas with glue, I'm typically going to do that directly on the track. I'm not typically going to do that in parallel. Or if I'm having consistency compression, if I'm needing a more consistent performance, I'm always going to do that first. That's going to be on my track itself, because you will know if you have done consistency compression properly if you can't tell it's there. If you can tell it's there, you gone too far or you screwed up a particular setting. In reality, the point of it is to be an invisible presence, but to level out a performance. In order to get that, I want that to be first. Otherwise, I'm going to hear the compression. So yes, ultimately, when we talk about serial compression, if you zoom out to 1,000 feet looking down, we are talking about layering compression, and that's kind of the whole point of compression breakthrough, is learning how to layer compression throughout a mix so that you have extreme dynamic control by the end, but you're only doing 2 to 4 dBs of compression at a time with different compressors. We've got a follow-up from DJM. When might you use parallel compression on a mix bus? My understanding makes me think it might be problematic on a full mix unless you make a parallel effects mix bus. I'm not totally sure what you mean whenever you say my understanding makes me think it might be problematic. I think using a mix knob on a mix bus is totally fine. I don't know if I would set up a whole parallel effects chain for something like that. I guess you could. It's just way too much work. But if you're just using like a mix knob on a compressor, that's okay. At least I'll just say this. I'm unaware of any problems with it, and I've gotten good results with it. Balance. Everyone is saying, oh my God, thank you so much. Ugh. So embarrassing when I forget my own systems that I made up. The 4 different goals of compression: to glue, to enhance, to fix, and to balance. That was the one. It's like kind of the most important one out of all of them. Goodness. Okay. We've got time for one more question. We'll answer Charlie Flint's. If I didn't get to your question, I'm going to make sure that I answer your question first at the beginning of next week's coaching session. So don't think all is lost. It will get answered. Or I'm going to be emailing you separately to answer it through email. Excuse me. I am just... stomach's doing all sorts of weird things today. So we're going to end with Charlie Flint's. This is a question on 2 styles of gain staging. In mixing for beginners, there's one type of gain staging that aims at reducing the clip on the stereo output. Whereas in the gain staging Q&A you do, it seems to be aimed at reaching the digital sweet spot. My question is, are both necessary? Do I do the VU meter gain stage followed by the volume gain stage to reduce clipping? Also, by the end of the gain stage, should the stereo out be sitting roughly around -6 dBs? So, yeah, quick answer to your question. Yes, you should be doing both. If you're trying to keep stuff from clipping, hopefully doing a proper gain stage, to a VU meter, with the exception of your percussive tracks, is going to help you do that. But ultimately, how you set up your volume balance is going to be the best defense you have against clipping. So whenever you're talking about gain staging to prevent clipping, that is sort of like the very, very, very basic version of gain staging. But the deeper that you get into mixing, the more advanced you become, the more that just kind of becomes not so much of a problem because of the other systems that you're putting into place. So I would say definitely do the gain staging where you're trying to hit that digital sweet spot. And then hopefully, if you do your volume balance correctly, that should sort of take care of any problem that you might be having that would create the need to gain stage to keep your stereo output from clipping. And then as far as should the stereo output be sitting at roughly -6 dBs, man, this is a big myth that got started like 15 years ago when all of this tech came to market. It doesn't matter where you put your mix bus. That's a kind of headroom that is just a total misnomer. People think that like, oh, the mastering engineer needs to have my mix bus sitting at like 6 to 3 dBs. They don't. They can turn up or turn down your mix as much as they need. They care a lot more about headroom in terms of dynamic range than they care about how close it is to clipping. It's like for them, as long as it's not clipping, it's fine. It just can't be clipping. Now, you might want to gain stage your mix bus, if you're wanting to get that digital sweet spot for your mix bus plugins as well. And you can just do that with a gain plugin at the very beginning of your chain if you want to do that. But you don't have to do that, right? As long as you're not clipping at any point in your mix on your mix bus, you're totally fine. I would focus on the other definition of headroom, which is decreasing or increasing dynamic range, rather than getting wrapped up in kind of this urban myth of like, it has to be at 6 to 3 dBs. Okay, so I think we are going to call it there. As I said, if I didn't get to your questions, I'm going to make sure that we get to those first next week, or be looking out for an email from me. I might be answering them kind of on my own time. Real quick, I saw a question from Kent in the comment section saying, where do I get this form to add my questions? The link to the form is in the emails that got sent out with the link to this coaching session. So go check that out. It should be there. The questions form remains open throughout the week. It's the same link every single week. So if you have a question at any point in the week, go ahead and submit your question then. You don't have to wait until Thursday. I would ask that you hold off on doing more than 2 questions per week. That just helps us to get through as many as we can during the actual session itself. So I think we're going to call it there. Everybody have a great rest of your week, and I'll talk to you all very soon. Bye.